Good evening or afternoon or morning, depending on what time zone you're joining us from. I'm Dan Kurtzvalen. I'm the editor of Foreign Affairs magazine, and it's my great pleasure to open this discussion on the vast and not inconsequential topic of world order in the 21st century. This discussion marks the publication of and gives us an opportunity to grapple with the arguments that are within a volume titled Anchoring the World that grew out of a partnership among Chatham House and the Council on Foreign Relations, the Georgetown School of Foreign Service, and Foreign Affairs. The first three institutions are celebrating their 100th birthdays. Foreign Affairs is a youthful 99, in case you are wondering. But to mark the 100th birthdays of those three institutions in due style, they together formed the Lloyd George Study Group on World Order with the generous support of the family of Robert Lloyd George, the great-grandson of David Lloyd George. In discussing the scope of the study group and the volume of essays that emerged, which you can read at foreignaffairs.com, it struck us that questions about global order are today as contested and complex and interesting as at any point in the century since Prime Minister Lloyd George and his fellow world leaders were wrestling with similar questions in the wake of World War I. For this audience, I don't need to recite all the reasons for that and the contours of that debate and those challenges. But I should add that the first meeting of this study group took place in London at the end of February 2020, when the only one of us personally familiar with the experience of lockdown, and probably the only one of us with the familiarity with the word lockdown, was a Chinese participant who was joining by video from China. And all that has transpired in the year or so since has really only made the questions of order that the study group started grappling with in early 2020 all the more interesting, and that process of grappling all the more essential. The hope at the outset of this process was to bring together thinkers and practitioners with a range of perspectives, and to allow them to offer different and often opposing arguments about what this moment of order building, as Charlie Kupchan and Leslie Benjamin call it in their introduction to the collection, what this moment should bring or will bring. And the resulting essays, I think, fully vindicated that hope in my editorial view, at least, both in what each offers on its own, but perhaps even more in the ways that they complement or complicate the arguments of others. And I hope what we can do today is both offer a kind of subset of those arguments, but really allow some of the authors represented in that collection to engage with the arguments of the other pieces. We have a wonderful subset of the authors in the collection with us today. I really do recommend that you read the whole thing, because there are a number of other great essays that are not represented on the panel today. I won't spend time summarizing the long and distinguished biographies of our speakers, which you should all have, other than to very briefly introduce them. We have Robin Niblett, the Director-in-Chief of Executive of Chatham House, as you all know, who co-authored an essay in the collection with Leslie Benjamin titled "Liberal Order Begins at Home: How Democratic Revival Can Reboot the International System." We have Anne-Marie Slaughter, the CEO of New America, and I should say my one-time boss when she was director of the State Department's policy planning staff. She is the co-author of an essay with Gordon LaForge called "Opening Up the Order: A More Inclusive International System." Rana Mitter, one of today's great historians of modern China and director of Oxford's China Center, wrote the essay "The World China Wants: How Power Will and Won't Reshape Chinese Ambitions." Charlie Kupchan, professor at Georgetown and senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, whose piece, which was co-authored with Richard Haass, the president of the council, is called "The New Concert of Powers: How to Prevent Catastrophe and Promote Stability in a Multipolar World." And last but not least, Leslie Benjamin, co-author with Robin of "The Liberal Order Begins at Home." She is, as most of you know, the director of the U.S. and Americas program at Chatham House. So we will go in that order, with each speaker spending a few minutes both distilling elements of their own assessments of order building today, as well as considering some of the challenges to that vision and arguments of their fellow contributors. I then may take advantage of my position to ask a question or two before we go to all of you who are participating from other locations. I will remind you of a couple things at the outset. This is on the record and it's being recorded. And to ask a question, you can use the raise hand function at the bottom of the screen, and we will come to you to ask your questions orally. You will probably have to unmute yourself, but I will call on you, and I will remind you of that when we get to the end of these opening remarks. So let's go to Robin to kick us off.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks very much for hosting this meeting and sharing us and moderating this conversation. And another chance for me to say a big thank you to you in Foreign Affairs for shepherding us together to getting to the point of getting all of these chapters out through the US election, which added all sorts of elements of uncertainty to the process. Obviously, a big thanks as well to Charlie and Leslie for leading the process on all of our behalf. And great to be partnering with CFR and the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service on this co-centenary effort. Good time to try to think big. So Leslie and I have actually not worked out a pitch. I think we'll probably each present the paper and then show how we try to handle our disagreements. There weren't many, of course, through the whole process. But I'm sure we'll end up emphasizing different aspects of the paper. But I think we were pleased. I think we drew what people thought was the short straw at the time. You can imagine at the height of Trumpery, to have to write the paper that was about defending the liberal order and showing how it would survive. And Leslie and I said, yeah, we're going to do it. We believe in it, more to the point. And we're going to try and write it. So I'm pleased we drew that particular straw. My interpretation of the thesis, I suppose, or the thesis I want to put forward is that a world order that is dominated by liberal democracies, or at least in which liberal democracies together have the strongest voice, is one that's going to offer the best opportunity and chances of global peace and security. It is the preferred outcome, and therefore it's the outcome that I think we should be striving towards. Obviously, I'm not going to do a complete description through all of the others, though I think in Charlie and Richard's paper, they describe some of the weaknesses of some of the other alternatives out there. What I would say at the outset is that I think clearly we're in a world in which there is huge forces of disintegration, of challenge to the established order built around the UN system, at least. I won't call it a liberal world order, because I don't think it is at this time. But we are obviously in a multipolar world, one that is fragmenting, that has all sorts of risks to security in the future. But I don't want to be fatalistic about it. I don't think, therefore, we say, well, that's where the world's going. How do we adapt to it? Simply because I think a truly multipolar world order, or a multipolar world in which maybe a concert of powers tries to come together to impose order, is not going to be one that is stable over time. Xi Jinping has talked for a while now about this community of common destiny. In other words, we don't need to share values. As long as we have a common destiny around climate change or global health or the global economy, we can come to agreement on things. But I don't think it's enough. There is going to be a deep lack of trust between the global powers of the world, built around the fact that non-liberal democracies, and specifically autocracies like China, are constantly worried about their lack of domestic legitimacy and risks of collapse. Rana may or may not agree with that interpretation. I'll see what he says later on. But that sense of insecurity drives what people have classically called the security dilemma, this thing that you then have to compensate all the time to make sure that you're not caught out. And so that community of common destiny, when built around an order that incorporates equally, if it were to, all of the great powers of the world, I think would be unstable. I also think that those powers that are not democracies carry within them the seeds of their own ultimate potential collapse, and therefore, a sort of multipolar world order contains within it, if it doesn't have liberal democracies trying to drive the agenda, additional risks of collapse. And in the end, I don't think many societies in the West would accept kind of a world order in which one treats non-democracies as partners and equals across the board. We've seen how difficult it is to try to apply realist policy, as the British government is discovering, towards China, or towards Saudi Arabia, or towards any other number of non-democracies. So, I mean, that's enough of my kind of thesis. What we talk about in the paper is what can we do about it? And I think we need to recognize right from the outset that the problems for liberal democracies and the reason that we are in the situation we're in is that we overreached. And I won't go through the whole thing. I think this is a well accepted position that the liberal democracies did not adapt to the globalization that they unleashed and are currently desperately trying to catch up and repair the damage they did to their own societies, and which have then led to that loss of confidence and loss of engagement, and in Donald Trump, withdrawal from the multilateral system that they helped create. They are already responding. So I think that revival of liberal order beginning at home is underway. The Biden administration has certainly stepped up and said, this is what we need to do to rebuild at home. And you know the list and the money that is being set aside to do that. And ultimately, it will be only if liberal democracies can rebuild a sense of domestic legitimacy that they will then be able to project their capabilities into the world order. I'll come to that in a second. Clearly, rebuilding at home is going to require an element of almost having to protect yourselves while you undertake that change. And one of the issues we talk about in the paper, whether it's about immigration, whether it's about limits on foreign investment from countries that are operating under different systems, the idea of a completely open system is not going to be sustainable as liberal democracies seek to try to rebuild at home. So we've got to recognize that trade-off between some of the values of openness we've associated with the liberal democracies and the period of fixing yourselves, which is going to be going on for a good 5 to 10 years at least. And obviously, it is going to be contested as we do it, though I would say, looking at Italy, at Germany, thinking of Europe in my standpoint, and even actually where the Conservative Party is, and the way Britain has dealt with populism, I don't think there's an inevitable takeover by the barbarians of the gate of the liberal democracies at home. I think the second part of our thesis is that you definitely also need to think about expanding that liberal democratic camp if you're going to have a world order in which liberal democracies have a strong voice. We avoided, Leslie and I remember the term the West. I think it was in our original title. In fact, we were given the term the West, and other members of the study group pushed us to get rid of it. And actually, we didn't need much pushing in the end, which is why I keep referring to liberal democracies. And I suppose the whole point is that liberal democracies will only be able to help rebuild a world order that reflects a lot of their values and the stability inherent in them if we can build that community out better. It's tended to exist as a transatlantic community, with the US handling it in one space, and then really a Pacific community principally on the other side. But we're going to have to knit together much more effectively if we're going to be able to be strong at a global level as we try to rebuild at home. So we talk quite a bit in the paper about the need to rebuild transatlantic cooperation, but also a bit about this notion of expanding, let's call it the G7. A G7 plus would be the idea. I'm skeptical, Leslie, I think is skeptical as well of the D10 idea. I think we said we were skeptical in the paper jointly, so I'm always cautious about talking on behalf of Leslie. But we definitely think that there is, especially in this COVID environment, a real opportunity to knit together the Atlantic and the Pacific liberal democracies around some of the common rebuilding agenda after COVID, which is going to have to be built around common usage of data and the use of that data to drive both global health integration and recovery, and also global economic recovery, will have to be done around liberal democratic values of privacy, the rights of the individual, how you share data and on what basis. That has to be part of the agenda for a reviving Western conception and liberal democratic conception of international order. I'm therefore a big critic of European strategic autonomy if it's all about the EU getting strong as compared to America. We must think much more in a collective sense. Can we enlarge then that order to non-democracies? Clearly, we're trying to do that right now in the context of climate change, and we may try to do it in the context of global health coordination. But our ability to do that is going to be that much stronger as liberal democracies if we're operating collectively in that process. The last thing I'd say is a little bit about risks. I think, Dan, you asked us to say something about risks. My comment on risks, as I think about it, number one is the return of populism. As Europeans, we look at America with bated breath, I would say, even at the congressional upcoming elections, and certainly at 2024, having seen the strong support for a Trumpian vision of America. But in France, we've got an election coming up next year, which will be very interesting. To put it mildly, this is not just a US feature, and we've seen how fragile democracies continue to fall in Southeast Asia in particular. This is definitely a very contested time, and so we can never take that journey we're on to rebuild ourselves and fix ourselves for granted. The second and only, my closing point, would be on whether we end up with different approaches to China. I was part of a conversation yesterday that I found especially interesting, because I think there is a debate taking place within our societies, but could become more formally a divide between the United States and its allies in Europe and its allies in Southeast Asia, about whether we are trying to defeat China or contest China from a position of strength. I'd say the European approach, from a majority standpoint, is to contest from a position of strength, but the frequent references to winning and winning over China that we hear in a lot of the US debate at the moment, even from the current administration, makes me nervous, the ability for us to hang together as a liberal democracy in trying to rebuild the order. I'll stop there.
Thanks, Robin. And as we go to Anne-Marie, I also want to say, as you've watched in kind of fascinating ways, the Biden administration wrestle with some of the tensions between domestic and foreign with regard to vaccine distribution globally, especially in the kind of debate over whether it was quick enough and in what ways it should be helping India right now. I just want to say that Anne-Marie wrote a really important piece that you can see as the editor's choice on our website right now, making the case for a much more expansive US-led effort to help vaccinate the world, which is especially important right now. That is not the topic she's going to be talking about today, but I did want to just mention that before we go to Anne-Marie to talk about her vision of a more open and bottom-up order.
Thanks, Dan. And that is highly relevant because I do see, for instance, the difference between my paper and Gordon and my paper and Charlie and Richard Haas's paper, in part, is exactly a kind of great power politics view of the world versus a much more globalist or global, not globalist, but global view of the world that plays out in the debate between should you practice vaccine diplomacy and meet with the Quad and compete with China over vaccinating people, or should you say that the goal is to get as many people vaccinated globally as we possibly can, and this is no time for great power politics. I was happy to see that they referred to the arsenal of vaccines. That's not the way they were talking about it previously. So I'm going to make a case for a very different vision of world order, and I'm going to start by saying that both Gordon and I begin from the premise that it's almost impossible, certainly highly unlikely, that the world in 2045 will be run by the same countries that were put in power to run it in 1945. And you have to think to yourself, imagine if the world in 1945 had been run by the same great powers as 1845. In the same structures, in the same ways. I mean, there's certain, big nations are more powerful than small nations, although even there, as power is getting redefined, it can shift. But over a century, either there's going to be a real crisis where we actually, the world's nations come back together and create some alternative structure, which I think is not likely, but certainly possible. Or, as I think you're already seeing, the UN system continues and is important for some purposes, but is increasingly irrelevant for others. And so it's like academic centers. They never die. They just kind of gradually drift. But in terms of where the real power is, by 2045, there will be and is already a different world order taking shape. So we start from that premise. And then we ask the question, well, so what's the purpose of a global order? Clearly in 1945, again, building on 1921, 1922, and the Peace of Versailles, the goal was, first of all, to create peace and to stop the scourge of war. Article 2.4 is really, that's what it's there for. And in many ways, the UN has had a positive impact, but so have nuclear weapons. And so it's hard to disentangle those. It has not been very effective in stopping the kinds of wars we have been fighting since the end of the Cold War, all the hybrid wars, all the internal wars of various kinds. And just think about when Russia invaded Ukraine, the UN was nowhere. I mean, it didn't. Now, it's always a function of, obviously when there's conflict between the members of the Security Council, it's very difficult. But I would say overall, if you ask individuals around the world, or at least in the United States, how relevant is the United Nations to the security problems that affect your life? They would start right now with the pandemic. They would talk about climate change. They would talk about terrorism. They might talk about global crime. Yes, they would talk about China, but probably not in the sense of fearing war with China. They might talk about Chinese economic power. But on all those problems, the current global order is not doing a very good job of actually problem solving. And ultimately, that's the metric by which it has to be judged, and we need something else. So that's the premise. I guess the other way to ask the question is, if the UN disappeared tomorrow, what would happen? I think the world would be worse off. I'm not anti-United Nations at all. I'm just trying to reflect what I think is reality. But you have the G20, you have all the regional organizations. China's building a bunch more. You have effectively a version of coalitions of the democracies, whether or not they're formally that way. And in many ways, we'd be worse off, but we would certainly not be back to the world of pre-1945, nothing close. So then let us think about what could be more effective in actually tackling global problems. And here again, I differentiate between great power competition and global problems. They are connected in many ways, but I really do think that you can think about international affairs in terms of those conflicts or competition or cooperation between states, that the world that I call it the world of the chessboard, the world of all those brightly colored squares and other shapes on the map and the globe, and the world of individuals and organizations, the world of networks, the world, if you see a picture of the world at night and you can't see all those borders. And the problems that are most important right now, the existence of the planet, pandemics, again, global violence of different kinds, access to food, access to water, the things that really are imperiling our ability to exist on the earth are much more global problems, although states play a huge role in being able to address them, but not enough. So our proposal for opening up the order is to take the state-based order and open it up to global actors, individuals, organizations, civic groups, corporations, all the active philanthropies, all the actors that are in fact playing an active role, but give them a more formal role. The signal sort of the emblematic example of this is the Paris Agreement, where yes, you needed states to come together and create the framework for action, but they depended on non-party stakeholders, even in the agreement, everything from billionaires to mayors to governors to all the civic groups and corporations. You're seeing the same thing with the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization, and indeed with COVAX right now. Our proposal is that those actors, those global actors, actually be given some status at international law. You have the International Committee for the Red Cross, you have various observer statuses. There are ways to actually create some formal status for global actors. We desperately need them. I mean, you're never going to fight climate change with only national governments, even if they all agreed. You have to mobilize all the resources of other actors in society. And the way we would do that is through something that we call impact hubs. So again, I'm going to take the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization as my paradigmatic impact hub. The Gates Foundation created it with the World Health Organization, so there's still a role for international organizations, but also with a whole group of non-governmental organizations and pharmaceutical companies. It is the hub for vaccinating almost 1 billion children in the world, and now for vaccine distribution to the world at large. Imagine if you built that up and poured investment into it and measured its success in terms of how far it advanced toward the sustainable development goal of global health. And imagine if you did that for all the sustainable development goals. You created hubs. Some of them might be international or regional organizations, the ones that are doing a good job. I can imagine refugees taking the UN High Commissioner for Refugees and connecting it to all the non-governmental organizations, the big 8 NGOs, lots of other players in the refugee space. And again, pour money in and measure the result. 2 more points, 3. First, those impact hubs have a real potential in an age of impact investing in which $3 trillion, that's a lot of money, is now available in impact capital. In other words, if impact investors are investing in companies that align with the SDGs and are monitored, that's what's so critical here. You need the metrics that impact investors are creating. If they are monitored to see if we invest here and we invest in this hub, how much progress are we making? And that has to be open and transparent. That could truly make a difference. Last point before I get to the downside. This is not just much more open in terms of the liberal ideal of open society. I went for that liberal ideal rather than liberal democracies, which is a change because in 2006, John Eikenberry and I argued for a concert of democracies. It's a much more open way of global problem solving. It will also bring a lot of players who are not currently in foreign policy in. If you look at mayors and governors and NGOs and even corporations, you will get a far more diverse group of people participating, which we need. The downsides are it's very messy. The beauty of Charlie and Richard's approach is, you just get a handful of nations into the oak paneled room and you can make decisions and get things done. I recognize that. This is very, very messy. The legitimacy problems will continue. I mean, so which NGOs and what do you have to do to be recognized at international law in some way? And it will be inefficient at least in the short term. But my proposition would be, A, this is already happening. B, we cannot actually solve global problems without mobilizing all these actors. And C, this vision of how we should mobilize all actors is actually a great liberal strength. It doesn't have to draw lines between democracies and non-democracies, but believe me, the autocracies will not be so crazy about this model. So I think I'll stop there.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. A couple shots fired in Charlie's direction, but before we give him a chance to defend himself, we'll go to Rana. I should say, Rana had a slightly different task than the other authors in that he was not advocating for a certain approach from the perspective of Washington or the UK or some collection of liberal democracies, but was trying to explain the way Chinese leaders see this question and how that those views are likely to change as China's power changes. So I want to make clear that he is not necessarily endorsing this view as he tries to explicate it. So Rana, we will go to you.
Thanks very much indeed, Dan. And again, thanks to everyone involved in this event, Chatham House and from Foreign Affairs for bringing it together. I think it's a wonderful opportunity. Thanks also for your initial warning. As I say, my job here is a slightly different one from the other speakers in that I'm trying to put forward a couple of thoughts about China, not, I hasten to add, in any sense that I'm endorsing these particular views, but I think what I would endorse is the wider sense that if we're going to have these conversations, and we have to have them, about a rapidly changing global order, and also about an order that is clearly going to change considerably under the impact of the pandemic, which we haven't mentioned that much specifically, because I think I can give a spoiler to say that's going to come up later more explicitly, so we're staying a little bit away from it. But if we're going to do all of that, then understanding the premises on which China is putting forward its engagement with the dominant order, perhaps not so liberal, but still, visibly liberal in large part, is a more urgent task. And the way I'm going to do that in a short time is first to say, please do read all the essays in the Foreign Affairs volume so that you get the full versions of all of them. But then to say, I think there are one set of factors that I think shape where China is now and how it thinks about itself. A couple of others that also shape where it's come from, which I think shape the way that it looks at where it's going to. And finally, and perhaps most significantly for this conversation, things which I think could well trip it up, but are also going to be very much on Chinese policymakers' minds as they think about how to engage with the order that it is under consideration in most of this conversation. So to go through those quickly, but I hope concisely. The first one is that I think one really central point I wanted to make in the essay I wrote is that the type of polity, the type of state, the type of international actor that China is today is in some ways quite historically unprecedented, at least in the modern era. And as a historian, I think I'm allowed to say that, since I've been looking at the past for probably more time than is good for me. The particular factors which I go into in more detail, which I think provide a unique combination of factors, are specifically China's authoritarian nature, its ability to create a successful consumerist society, its global ambition, sort of globalization, Chinese style, you might say. And I think the one that's really shifted the way that we think about China and the way that China thinks about itself in the world, technology and its use of that technology. To briefly say, again, why I think these things come together in such an unusual way. The authoritarian element is important because I think it's the element that pushes back most against the particular driving central factor that the other speakers have said, and I think we'll go on to say, is so important. Even if we don't think of it as an order of liberal democracies, we still think of it as a liberal order. Liberal is one thing that I do not think that China either regards as being necessary or even in some cases legitimate to the order that there is. The idea of something that is rationally ordered in the way that I think they put it forward, for sure. But the idea that rationality and liberalism necessarily go together is not a starting point that I think China would come from. And internally, the fact that nowadays it's entirely clear about the fact that it has a party state which it regards as meritocratic, but not as one that is trying to move towards liberal democracy. China does not regard itself as a sort of flawed liberal democracy in embryo. It sees itself as something really quite different and quite other. That's a very important starting point. Linked to that, and perhaps something that links to some of the other points as well importantly, is that question of consumerism. And I use that point rather than consumption, or even talking about the kind of way in which the old Soviet Union stressed its ability to produce certain types of civilian goods, because the ability to create a lifestyle in which consuming, something that all of us in the West in the Cold War became very, very familiar with in the Nixon versus Khrushchev kitchen debate, all of that. Well, China has done, whatever else you think of it, extremely well on those grounds. It now has immensely commercial, immensely competitive actors who, for the most part, have most of their footprint domestically, but a reminder that domestic China means a quarter of the world's population and a very large proportion of the world economy as well. So being able to create what the Soviet Union never did, that lifestyle that really appeals to a very large number of people and basically gives them quite a high satisfaction level, that is a really important bedrock in which China is then able to project its view to the outside world, because it can sit more confidently on the understanding that it's managed to create a domestic constituency that, if you're not from Hong Kong and you're not from Xinjiang, for a lot of people is perhaps at least tolerable to even being rather widely admired. And I would put the caveats in there as well as the positive. Global ambition. I think this is one of the areas which I think is most relevant to what we're talking about today. And it takes many, many aspects. The Belt and Road Initiative, which people talk about a great deal, is important, but it's the manifestation, it's the vehicle, it's not the idea itself, it's the sizzle, not the steak in this sense. And I would say that global ambition, the idea that China wants to have influence in different ways, in different kind of manifestations around the world, is now something that's certainly been stated very explicitly, not least by top party leaders for the last 4 or 5 years, but also beyond that. It's worth noting that that can take all sorts of different forms. It can take economic influence, obviously being an important one in every part of the world, military influence, much more important at the moment in China's immediate peripheries, but those peripheries are growing, as anyone who looks at the question of the Arctic, of course, will tell you. And the final one, in a sense, is worth noting briefly rather than at length, because actually the brevity, I think, shows how much the world has changed. Certainly 20 years ago, and I think even 10, talking about China as a major innovator of global technological capacity, norms, and production would not have been something that I think most of us would have put forward. We would have taken refuge in, I said, and I think many other people did as well, China's authoritarian state, it can imitate, it can't really innovate. Well, you know what? China can innovate. It innovates a great deal. It does it every day. And if you go to Shenzhen, if you go to Hangzhou, if you go to Haidian up in the northwest of Beijing, you'll see plenty of signs of that. It's also worth remembering that technology doesn't just mean artificial intelligence, voice recognition, all the things that we think about, particularly in terms of their military applications. And the ability of China to use factor C, the consumerism, to produce one of the world's biggest consumer economies, along with one of the world's most vibrant military production capacities, is also, of course, part of the mixture. But along with that, remember, anti-COVID vaccines are technology too. They're very important as part of the so-called Health Silk Road. And by the way, in case you haven't been, I'm sure most people here have been looking quite closely, but the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, has changed a lot in the last year. It's not so much about bridges and bricks and mortar so much anymore, although of course that's still there in some sense. It's very much about vaccine rollout, and it's very much about cyber capacity. And in particular, vaccine production is a very large part both of getting the domestic situation under control and also being able to produce a kind of technology that China can use successfully around the world. Right now, I think we know before it got suppressed that China's vaccines are okay, but not that great. 50%, 60% effectiveness, not as good as Pfizer, not as good as Oxford AstraZeneca. But bearing in mind what I've just said, how much do you want to bet that's still going to be true about China's vaccines in 5 years from now, or even 2 years from now? One thing we have seen is that China knows where it makes technological mistakes, and it puts lots of resources and lots of very, very good scientists into upgrading them. So putting those factors together, authoritarianism, consumerism, globalization, global ambition, and technology, I think does come together in terms of more than the sum of its parts. In other words, these factors coming together shouldn't just be treated as separate strands, but they should be treated as really an entire political proposition, which has both in its own terms worked successfully at home. I do not share the premises of the CCP. I love liberalism, I love democracy, but that is a different argument from the question of whether or not at the moment there is a reasonably stable combination of these factors at home. Are they going to work so well internationally? That has yet to be seen, but anyone who uses TikTok, anyone who's received a Sinovac vaccine in in Brazil, or in the UAE may at least want to have the jury out on that particular question. And of course, this is a work in progress. This is a very protean, very changeable set of factors, which China is putting a great deal of its considerable thinking capacity into changing. One last note about where this could go wrong, because I don't want to suggest for a moment this is some kind of inevitable linear move towards essentially getting to where China might want to be. The first factor is that I think in the end, China still hasn't quite worked out really what it does want that changed world to look like. It wants enough of the current order and the United Nations to essentially look quite like it is, because lots of those bits still actually work very well for China. A World Health Organization in which China has lots of influence is much better than a UN where the WHO doesn't exist at all. And the same is true with an awful lot of the aspects of international legal provision and norm provision, which actually does China's outward facing economic and military strategy a great deal of good. So working out what you might sort of summarize as a welfarist authoritarian developmentalism actually is, and how it gels with China's, I think, quite genuine sense that it doesn't want to create large numbers of mini Chinas around the world. That's not what it's looking to do. China itself hasn't fully answered that question. That makes it harder for us. The other 2 points are that China remains a Marxist-Leninist society. Xi Jinping talks about that a great deal, very openly. And I think that when we're talking about liberalism, let's remember what we're contrasting it is. When China talks about itself as being Marxist-Leninist, talking about contradiction, talking about struggle, terms which any good Hegelian, even bad Hegelians, will understand. I think we should take that seriously and understand that Chinese works of theory deal very explicitly with the difference between these two systems, along actually with traditional Chinese thinking as well. And the final factor, and I think this is the one that is perhaps more crucial than any other, is that the continuing growth of Chinese power and influence, which I think is real and which will continue to grow for some time, is not infinite. I think the 2020s are a really, really important decade, because at the end of that decade, if not before, China's demographics will change, and not in China's favor, as everyone here, I suspect, in this grouping knows. Xi Jinping, if he keeps on being rechosen at the top, will be going into his 5th term. And as Mr. Putin has showed, you can keep going on, but it doesn't always mean that you have sufficient ideas and ballast behind you to keep that going. So I think that's something that needs to be kept in mind. And also, the rest of the world will have changed, not least because of all the great ideas being put forward in this particular forum. So I think that the 2020s are a decade that China certainly sees as immensely crucial. And I hope I've given a very brief account of some of the ways that I think that China is using its own frameworks to think about how that decade might be tackled in terms of that changing order. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks very much, Dan.
Thank you, Rana. We will go to Charlie on the new concert of powers.
Thank you, Dan. And thanks to all of you for participating in this call and also in the volume. It's been a pleasure to work with you. I'm going to start off with just a few observations that I think are probably shared across all of us, not necessarily fully, but some sort of starting points that I think are important to put out there. One is that today, the issue that we're addressing in the volume is extremely important. That is to say, there is a gap today between the demand for global governance and the supply of global governance that has to be addressed. And that just sort of banking on the status quo or doubling down on the status quo isn't going to do the trick. And that's because we just see the multiplication of global problems that are not being adequately addressed, whether it's global warming or the pandemic or major power rivalry or the absence of global approach to cybersecurity. So there's a problem out there that needs to be addressed. The second observation I would make is that there is, I think, a dissatisfaction that the current state of play, if tinkered with here and there, is going to do the job. And so I think that whether it's Anne-Marie's approach, which is sort of opening up the order and getting civil society to be more engaged, or the approach that Richard and I look at, which is a kind of gathering of key players, something needs to give, right? There needs to be innovation, because we're moving into a world that will be characterized by the following characteristics. One, multipolarity, or in my view, it will be a mix of bipolarity and multipolarity. Two, peer competitors, the US and China, multipolar, and that there will be other significant centers of power that aren't closely aligned with either the United States or China. Interdependent. We've never really been in a world that is, number one, this interdependent, whether it's economically, ideologically, social media, but without a clear captain at the helm, because we've been living in a world that has been anchored by the West for quite a long time. And I think it will be in a world that's ideologically diverse. I don't know anybody who believes that Russia, China, and other non-democracies in a geopolitical consequential time are going to move in the direction of embracing liberal democracy. So when I look at that landscape, I come away with the view that we have a problem, that we need to find a way to speed cooperation across ideological dividing lines, mainly because of China. And China will have the world's largest economy by the end of the decade. I take the points that Rana just made about the 2020s maybe being the high watermark and demography kicking in after that, but we're still talking about a country that has a lot of people and a country that is going to be a global player. Look at Belt and Road. Look at the fact that the largest investor, FDI, in Africa by far is China. That China has built 70% of Africa's 4G network, right? That we can't put China back in the bottle. We have to find a way of working with China and trying to address global challenges in a way that is more cooperative than it is confrontational. And that brings me to the conclusion that Richard and I arrive at in our piece, and that is that what's missing today is a forum where key players, the world's most influential countries, are in contact on a day-to-day basis, discussing day in, day out, the key issues of our time, both resolving flashpoints, for example, Taiwan, NATO enlargement, and Ukraine, civil wars in Syria or in Africa or wherever, and the longer term issues, cybersecurity, the regulation of digital economy. There needs to be a place where these issues are being joined on a regular day-to-day basis. That's not happening today. It's criminal. It's a huge omission, right? G20 meetings once in a while don't do it. The UN Security Council is mainly grandstanding and communiques. It's not a place where serious day-to-day conversations are taking place. And so we propose a global concert of the major players with representation from all the world's regions via their regional organizations as a way of adding value. It would be consultative, not decisional. It would tee up decisions that would be handed off to the UN or the World Bank or the IMF or the WHO to actually take a movement and implement them. But we do feel that there is a serious omission in the absence of that kind of forum. And we don't see this as exclusive. It's completely compatible with some of the other ideas that are out there. I see it very compatible with Anne-Marie's approach, although I'm sure she would reject that idea because she doesn't like our Oak Room proposal, but a sort of bottom up and a top down effort to speed global governance strikes me as a very smart way to go about the problem. But our bottom line is that the status quo is not going to do the trick. We're in a globalized, multipolar, interdependent world without a captain at the helm for the first time in history. We need to think innovatively and creatively about how to deal with the challenges of global governance. We'll stop there.
Thanks, Charlie. We will go to Leslie to finish off this round. I should say Leslie and Charlie together, I think, wrote a really thoughtful introduction that I think traces some of the similarities and fault lines. So Leslie, to the extent you want to cover some of that along with any places in which you disagree with your co-author on your proposal, please feel free.
Thank you. I'll try to be brief because I know we want to have a lot of engagement. I mean, a couple of things. First of all, thank you to Foreign Affairs because it really has been wonderful to have your stewardship, obviously, along with Charlie's and others, but really taking us through. And congratulations to you, Daniel, since you now run that journal. It is quite an extraordinary thing to be doing, and it looks pretty great at least from where I sit. The other thing I would say is I think the study group model is a wonderful way to work, and Mick Cox wrote a brilliant piece in International Affairs about the E.H. Carr-led study group that I think concluded in 1939 and was focused on the question of the nation and nationalism. It didn't clearly solve the problem, but I think that it's a wonderful way to work. It led to 3 publications, and the one the study group produced was apparently not the meaningful one. But the 20 years crisis was clearly very much informed by those conversations. And I hope that this publication will be meaningful, but I also hope that it will drive a series of other conversations, and also that some of those will be focused in a productive way on what we've omitted. And I think that there are omissions, and some of them are by design in this volume, and I think we're very well aware of them. And so I would encourage others to take the mantelpiece and take it forward. The other thing I would say about the process is that it was really great for many reasons to write with Robin, because as we talked about any number of things that we used the same word for, whether it was human rights or democracy or immigration or sovereignty, Robin immediately thought about these through the lens of concrete debates in the United Kingdom and Britain and Europe and its role in the world. And I immediately thought about these things through the lens of the southern border and civil society and civil liberties in the Constitution versus international human rights. And so we were talking about the same things, but we really did have to negotiate what they meant in a concrete fashion in a way that allowed us to talk about the United States, the United Kingdom, and liberal democracies. And there are a lot of divisions, obviously, in terms of how these things play out and how they're contested, even within those countries that broadly accept, at least at the historical and national level, a certain set of assumptions and a certain set of principles. The next thing I would say is that COVID happened in the middle of this, right? We all turned up. We actually met in person in February. It was wonderful. We debated whether the International Studies Association meeting would take place, in the next month in person. I think I said to Dan Nexon and Alex Cooley, "You're out of your mind, no way." And they were like, "Really?" But obviously then before the second draft, we were all meeting online, and people had redrafted with that kind of in the middle, trying to reflect on what does that mean. And so I think you'll see that in the volume, that we haven't fully answered that question. And so there is room for more convening and more study group work. The next thing I would say is that I do think that a lot of these proposals are complementary, but they do have very serious points of tension. And I think in many ways, Charlie and Richard's is the most aspirational, it's the most liberal. People read it as realist, but in fact, the idea that by putting the United States and China and others at the table and talking, that suddenly there could be agreement on surveillance technologies and the need for liberty and privacy, that there would be agreement over Taiwan and questions of sovereignty and questions of the South China Sea. I mean, there are plenty of times when in international relations, countries have decided not to talk in order to move things forward. And I'm thinking of North Korea as well as to talk. So the idea that talking produces transformation, I think, is a big leap in international relations. And I'm not so sure that history suggests that there's evidence for this. Nonetheless, I'm a good liberal and I really like the idea. I have one specific reaction to Anne-Marie's comment, and Suzanne Nossel wrote a brilliant chapter on the United Nations, and she made a really good point. She said, you got to start with what you have, because we might spend 10 years trying to get a concert of powers together, and God knows where we're going to be by then. So start with what you have. I think she's actually much more committed to the vision than that. But we tend to talk about the UN Security Council, and some of her proposals for reform are focused on the Security Council. But we all know that status matters and sovereignty matters. And getting rid of the UN, and I suspect, Anne-Marie, I don't know, we'll see. I think you might agree with me that the UN General Assembly matters a huge amount. And so even if you bring in all these other actors and networks and you start solving problems in complex and rigorous, and I love the chapter that Anne-Marie and Gordon wrote, I still think the UN General Assembly is possibly the most important international institution that we have, because it gives people a seat, not because it's productive, but because status absolutely matters. And in so many of these proposals, you know, people are other state leaders are very much marginalized. The Alex Cooley, I managed to see last week, and he and Dan wrote a great chapter, and he makes the point that the old way of doing human rights advocacy and transformation doesn't really work, and we're in a space where it's about contestation over values. And I guess this takes me a little bit to our piece, Robin's and mine, where we really do put the values right up front, and we say the way to tackle the values problem is to be able to model them by investing, not only reviving, but transforming the nature of our internal democracies. So many people recognize the importance of this. So it's a transformative project. It's a revivalist project, but it is inherently about values, contesting them and standing up for them globally, not because you want everybody to adopt them, but because you've got to keep that space. But that you need to do it, I think, through domestic investment and recognition. So I'll stop there. There's so much more to say, but I think there is a lot left out of the project, but I think that's exciting because it means that there's a lot more that can be done.
Great, thanks, Leslie. I'm going to resist the temptation to ask a bunch of questions of my own, though I have many for all of you, so we can go to other questions. As a reminder, raise your hand if you would like to get a question, and there are also a couple that I will ask on behalf of people who submitted them by chat. We'll start with Michael Harvey. Michael, you can unmute yourself and ask a question. Please keep it fairly crisp and brief so we can get to as many as possible.
Well, thank you very much. And I must admit this question was framed before I heard the contributions from Anne-Marie, Charlie and Leslie. But in a way, I think it makes it more relevant. So the question is the current makeup and structure of the permanent membership of the United Nations Security Council either relevant or effective in today's world? And if not, should the veto remain, and how should the membership be restructured? Thank you.
Easy place to start. Anne-Marie, do you want to take that on, or Charlie?
So I'm happy to. My proposal assumes that we will not get reform of the Security Council. If we had gotten reform of the Security Council and we looked like we were close with Kofi Annan briefly there, I pushed very, very hard for it in every way I could, then I would have written a different paper. But without that, then I think it's just fatally hamstrung. I mean, it's either gridlock, or if it works, it's leaving out many, many really important countries in the world. So I'd go with Leslie. I actually think the General Assembly is more important, although not for action. And I do just want to say, I think many of the smaller agencies can be impact hubs. And there are ways of creating digital cooperation, as the Secretary General recognizes, what he calls networked multilateralism, that could embrace many elements of what I'm saying. But so I'll leave it there.
I would just add that I agree with Anne-Marie in the sense that in an ideal world, the Security Council should be revised. The membership is anachronistic. Vetoes make it, very difficult to get serious work done. I don't think it will be reformed. It's too difficult. It plays a critical role. The smaller agencies play a critical role. And that's why, in the end of the day, my own view is if you can't fix it, leave it, let it do its good work, and figure out other ways to fill the gap.
Sorry, the next question we'll go to is from Dina Mufti. Her question is, if the big powers continue to ignore the rules-based system in the UN, the Iraq War being a kind of chief example of this, will this give rise to the continued erosion of liberal democracies? And if so, where will this lead? This might be a question for Leslie and Robin to start.
Dina, as always, a tough question. I don't think that failures at the international level necessarily lead to then the erosion of liberal democracies around the world. It might impact their credibility around the world, But to them internally, in a way, part of the problem is the sense by many voters that people in the governments in the United States, in Europe and others spend too much time worrying about the rest of the world, not enough time worrying about them. And I suppose if I were to be a little bit harsh about it, there's clearly a desire almost, not in many liberal democracies, for governments to buck the rules-based system. I mean, Boris Johnson in the UK flirts with that instinct. He more than flirts with it sometimes, to try to show that, you know, I'll look after us first. And obviously the vaccine nationalism is just another manifestation of that as well. So, you know, I think in our paper, what Leslie and I are trying to say is that it's important that liberal democracies create the space to fix themselves, or they're not going to be able to do anything on the world stage effectively. And in fixing themselves, there will be some moments of retreat or some moments of not being consistent at an international level with all of the values that they are trying to protect internally. And I think that's just a realistic way of having to deal with where we are right now. I'll stop there.
Leslie or anyone else want to add anything quickly?
I'll just add one quick sentence. I think, you know, the problem of hypocrisy is one, I love teaching this question because does hypocrisy matter or not? And when I was at Georgetown with Charlie, I think John Eikenberry used to ask this question every day, right? It was after the invasion of Iraq. I would say that my students, who tend to be from all over the world, London's a very international place, they absolutely believe that hypocrisy beyond its border has had a very damaging effect on civil society activists in their own countries, and that it restricts the space for making positive progressive change globally. It's a hypothesis. I tend to think that the last 4 years of Donald Trump's administration suggest that both hypocrisy and actually active rejection of liberal values are not a good thing and do constrain the space.
I'll just add one sentence. I would not advocate for the abolition of the UN Charter. And there's a whole body of law as an international lawyer. Absolutely not. I mean, we have, you know, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, there were the instruments that you needed where you had political will. So, but that doesn't address the issue of hypocrisy, and that's a much longer debate, but just want to clarify.
Rana, could I ask you for 30 seconds on that? Because you bring a different
yeah, I was going to burst in. Thank you for that. Yeah, I think one of the arguments that is used most commonly at the moment by China in international society is exactly the hypocrisy argument. And China has become extremely good at cherry picking particular examples that show why the liberal order in general, and the United States in particular, are acting against what the principles are. There's, I think, very briefly, both a good and a bad side to that. The good side is that it shows, I think, in large part that China has no intention of abandoning the existing system. I mean, these days it actually makes it a great deal of claim to the fact that it was, along with the US, signatory to the 1945 Charter. So I think the danger that China wants to kind of rip everything up and start again, as Chairman Mao might have done 50 or 60 years ago, is not the problem at the moment. The issue there, I think, is to do with definition of terms. I mean, I think we all know that, for instance, when it comes to human rights, or when it comes to the SDGs, which have been mentioned before, China holds very strongly to these being important ideas that must be pushed through the United Nations, but they are now using the considerable capacity they have to redefine how those terms are used. That's the area, I think, where there's going to have to be a lot more discussion. And in doing that, I think using them from the liberal side in ways that seem to suggest hypocrisy is going to be profoundly unhelpful.
Yeah, I'm going to group two questions together so we can get the last couple in, and then we'll give all of the speakers a chance to respond to elements of both of these. We'll do Adam Roberts and then Ian Bond.
Am I audible?
Yes.
I thought it was a wonderful panel, and I learned a lot from it. But I wonder whether, in discussing this issue, it mightn't be useful to have some even franker recognition of the limits of past ideas of a liberal international order, and where we need to take seriously the need to develop a somewhat more sophisticated notion of it. I mean, just obvious points are the assumption of many in the liberal political world and in writing that the whole world is destined to go down a liberal democratic path. And that seems to me to have been from the start a pretty questionable notion and not a good basis for starting out a constructive relationship with states of different types, which international relations has to be about. I could go on about other defects, but I think the essential point is, would it be useful to have such a frank acknowledgement?
Thank you. Ian, we'll go to you and then back to speakers.
Great, thank you very much. Yes, fascinating discussion. I mean, there were two questions I had. I mean, one is for Rana, which is, I mean, you said that the 2020s is a kind of crucial decade, and you've got the demographics kicking in. Is Xi Jinping actually making things worse? I mean, repression and innovation don't go together very well. And if I were a Chinese entrepreneur looking at the fate of Jack Ma, I might be thinking, do I really want to build the kind of innovative companies and ways of doing business that Jack Ma has done, if this is where you end up? So that's a question to Rana. My question to Charlie, I mean, I read the essay with great interest and mounting horror, I must admit. And I guess the thing that horrified me in a way was that it seemed to assume that an awful lot of decisions would be taken over the heads of the countries and peoples most affected by them. And it wasn't clear to me that that actually produces more stability or a better outcome in the end, as opposed to actually just increasing the number of people who are really hacked off with the way things are turning out.
Let me add one last question as well from Bernard Herrmann.
Yes, based upon the assumption that United States is Taiwan's principal guarantor, in the event of further tensions, is there enough cross-party support in the United States to support possible military protection policy of Taiwan?
All right, thank you. So three challenging questions. Let's just go down back down the line with each speaker having about 90 seconds to react to elements of those in closing. So Robin, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I'm not going to obviously be able to do more justice, but great to hear Adam as well, who I haven't spoken to for a while. But just to pick up one of the questions about legitimacy, which is such an important element here. I think we're all struggling with trying to work out a world order that's going to be fit, as Anne-Marie said at the beginning, for 2045, not just 1945. And this real worry that what we've got now, and even to be frank, I think what Leslie and I were recommending may not be enough. But I suppose I'm more concerned at the moment about the risk of descent into chaos, actually, and needing a moment of pause rather than a moment of deep invention. And Adams, I think I've got his question right, about how we ensure capacity for coordination between states with very different value systems, different ideas of what works and what makes sense and what doesn't, is going to be incredibly difficult. I would simply note that autocracies are not keen to have non-state actors play important roles in international affairs. Or if they are, they make sure that they are not, they're just extensions of the government. And they tend to treat other people's non-state actors as extensions of their governments. So, we're at this moment where there's a huge amount of mutual suspicion. The liberal democracies feel weak and on the back foot, and I suspect Rana will have a better view that autocracies, whether it be China or Russia for that matter, carry this needling sense of insecurity, even with all that the Chinese government has achieved in recent years. My last point is, I'm sure Charlie will do this heavily British audience the pleasure of a quick comment as to why the UK is not in the concert of powers. I mean, give the UK a break. I suppose it's left with a seat as a permanent member of the UN Security Council, which is now not so important. But the fact that the EU is and the UK is not, they've got a little line about it, but I'd love to hear Charlie talk about it in his 90 seconds.
Thank you, Robin. Anne-Marie.
Oh, Adam, it is a pleasure to hear your voice, truly. And as you were asking, I sort of could hear Hedley Bull talking about the anarchical society and feeling very nostalgic. I will say that I think we should have that conversation. For me, it is not about whether the countries become liberal democracies or not. It is about which countries provide best for their people across the spectrum of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights. And I welcome that competition. And I want an international order that encourages that competition when it comes to actually making people's lives better. So the people side of the United Nations. I am really horrified when I hear Biden constantly talking about winning the 21st century vis-a-vis China. What on earth good does that do us? And most of the young people I know couldn't care less. I mean, he really sounded like a 20th century foreign policy person, because it was about winning the Soviet Union. We don't have to compete with China that way. We do have to compete on what is the best way forward. I know where I'd put my bets, but that's a matter of faith as much as anything else. 2 quick points on Taiwan. I think there's certainly enough domestic support in the United States. That doesn't mean that that's necessarily the right response, but I think were Biden to take some kind of action, and it would be very, very carefully thought out, he'd get the domestic support. And the last sentence is just on Rana's point about demography in China, with which I completely agree, but it is equally important to remember there are 34 million more men than women in China. That has never happened before. Comparable numbers in India. The idea of that many young men, size of Canada, almost Poland, running around without a spouse and a lot of frustration is a very scary prospect as well.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. Rana, a couple of China questions for you.
Yeah, a couple of quick thoughts on those. On the first one, which is about legitimacy, in the essay, one of the questions I put was essentially a challenge to the existing international order, which is that we, and I count myself as part of that order, have a lot of things that we say rightly that we don't like about what China's doing. You know, we don't like what it's doing at home to its own people in various ways. We don't like the way that it's throwing its weight around in the region and internationally, and many other aspects of the way that it deals with international society. Hedley Bull there again. Fine. But the question I then ask, and I don't have a good answer to it myself, but I think we need to ask it more, is what role is it that China could play in international society that we would be happy with, and which is plausible for China to put forward? Asking China to become a liberal democracy, I know that people aren't saying they want to do that, A, isn't going to happen, and B, is not politically plausible in any time scenario that I can see. So the question of what it is that we would let the China that actually exists in real life do is, I think, one that still needs to be asked and answered. But fortunately, since we have no time, I'm not going to answer it, or try and answer it myself now. And the other point on Ian's excellent question about Jack Ma, I think what I'd say on that, first of all, I used to believe that repression and innovation didn't go together until I saw what was happening in China. And I realized, unfortunately for us, yes, it does. Maybe not forever, maybe not as well in some areas as it does in liberal societies, but the idea that it doesn't happen in some really transformative ways is being disproved every day in Shenzhen, in Hangzhou, in Haidian. So that being the case, what about Jack Ma? I think talking about Jack Ma as an example of what's happening in Chinese entrepreneurship and the relationship between the state and society and business is a bit like taking Elon Musk as a typical example of everything about American entrepreneurship and its relationship with the state. There are plenty of people in China who are making lots of money, innovating, and actually, doing very well under the existing system, but we don't tend to know their names because they're not particularly interested in becoming celebrities. And that is the kind of entrepreneur that the Chinese Communist Party not only likes, but of course scoops into the party itself and embeds into the system. And that's one of the many reasons why separating the Chinese people from the party, a phrase which I've heard many, many times from liberals and Democrats who I deeply respect and understand where they're coming from, is, I think, on a hiding to nothing. That is not the kind of separation that is going to deal with the China that actually exists. We have to deal with the real China rather than an imagined China that liberals would like to exist but doesn't.
Thanks, Rana. Charlie?
Like Anne-Marie, I'm a former student of Adam Roberts, so it's a particular pleasure to hear his voice today. And I mean, I agree with you, Adam, that the assumption that history would move in a linear fashion, and that the democracies of the world would bring about the end of history, that has proved to be pretty naive. Maybe it will be the outcome, but it's going to take a long, long time. And for me, and I would like maybe Leslie to comment on this, one of the big questions of our day is how to speed and facilitate cooperation across ideological dividing lines. Not how to convert, not how to proselytize, not how to do what Anne-Marie said, Biden said last night, to win the century. I agree with her that that's not the way to go about this question. But how do we get countries that see things differently to come together on climate change, on pandemics, on traditional security issues? Because that's the world we live in. And it seems to me that the idea of doubling down on the liberal international order is just not going to cut the cake at a time in which, yes, okay, the democracies of the world may represent the lion's share of global GDP, but we don't live in a block world anymore, right? China is tethered to South Korea, to Japan, to Europe. And so it's a very messy, complicated place where an us versus them approach does more harm than good. On Ian's good question, I think you probably attribute too much power to the concert as Richard and I envisage it. It's a place to come together and to try to forge rules of the road and forge consensus. It is not a place that takes decisions and then enforces those decisions without the participation of the UN Security Council, the UN General Assembly, the IMF, whatever the relevant body is. It's really a place to bring people together and sustain strategic dialogue in a way that may get better outcomes. So what might have turned out differently? Maybe if there had been day-to-day discussion, we wouldn't have had a bust-up over NATO enlargement. Maybe if the US and China talk to each other every day over Taiwan, we're not going to have an accidental clash of an American and a Chinese ship. Maybe we could have avoided the worst of the civil war in Syria if key players had come together to talk about it. Final point, Robin, we can have a discussion about who should be in a concert if one ever forms and who should not be. I think that we included the EU and not the UK because the EU aggregates European power. The EU is as an aggregating force multiplier needed to be at the table. My hope is that the UK's relationship with the EU is strong enough that it might be a player in a concert if the EU is there. But it was the UK that decided to leave the EU, and I think that to some extent there are implications for that. But again, let's have a conversation about the UK's place moving forward.
Thanks, Charlie, and Leslie to close.
Thank you, Daniel. I guess, and I join the choir in just being delighted to see Adam Roberts on the call. I refer back to Adam's a talk that you gave at Georgetown. It must have been 2003-04 about intervention and legitimacy, and you made a really powerful argument, which was that if something was effective, in the end, it would be seen eventually to be legitimate. And I guess in some ways that takes me to our argument, mine and Robin's and mine, which isn't about evangelical proselytizing of a liberal democratic model. It's about making it effective for the people who currently live in these systems and structures, and also making it effective amongst the community of those who reside in liberal democracies. And the alternative isn't great, right? I mean, one doesn't want to think about an autocratic model for a country that's currently a liberal democracy, or just further disintegration and division. So I think making it effective is absolutely critical to making liberal democracy legitimate to the people who live within the borders of those countries that are legitimate. To Charlie's point, I think part of it depends on whether you think that conflict is a product of miscalculation and misperception and a lack of information sharing, which it sometimes is, or whether you think that conflict is a product of a very real difference of interest and values. And talking every day is likely if people actually share and are open about intelligence and everything else, which is a big if, is likely to solve that first problem, or at least go some distance towards it. But if there are just fundamental differences in interests and in values on questions having to do with how you regulate and govern and instill certain principles in technology, for example, then that's much tougher. I do agree that turning up is good, but one can turn up to the existing organizations. If the US had been much more heavily invested in the WHO and front-footed, would that have helped when there was a COVID outbreak in China? Possibly. That would have been a good way we should have at least tried. So I'm not proposed to the concert. I do think that Britain, given its nuclear deterrent and its tilt to the Indo-Pacific and its global Britain, should have a seat at the table. And I mean that in a serious way. I think that, you know, part 2 of the article should make the argument for why actually Britain should have a seat at the table. But I don't think that it's, you know, I think it would have to be alongside a whole lot of other things, which is not to say proselytizing and turning China into a liberal democracy. That's not going to happen.
Well, thank you, Leslie. And I apologize for going a few minutes over, and also to anyone whose questions we did not get to, but let me say thank you again to all of the speakers for a really rich and challenging set of remarks. Anne-Marie had another meeting starting right at 2:15, so she wanted me to pass on her regrets that she had to leave. But again, thanks to all of you. Thanks to Chatham House and Georgetown and CFR as well for joining together in this partnership. And please, everyone, do go read the essays by both the speakers here and the others at foreignaffairs.com, because there really is a rich set of pieces that I hope will provoke an ongoing debate, both within our pages, but also more broadly. So thank you all again. Have a good evening or day, and we'll look forward to continuing this conversation.